Chapter 17, Cross-Cultural Counseling, Engaging Ethnic Diversity, by Shannon Andrews, Michaela Boswell, Catherine Gambella, Alex Jones, and Jakara Scurry. To understand cross-cultural considerations in substance abuse counseling, one must ask themselves why culture matters. First, substance abuse is not an equal opportunity phenomena. This means that people use and get addicted to substances in very different ways. This can vary depending on gender or cultural group. Second, racial stratification exists between who is providing and receiving treatment. Primarily, professional staff members, researchers, and academic professionals are white. Paraprofessional staff members are largely non-white. Oftentimes, these paraprofessional staff members are recovering addicts themselves. Lastly, the breadth and depth of each racial or ethnic group's history and cultural perspective calls for an individualized understanding of each group and how substance abuse counselors may best serve them in practice. We'll now take an individual look at treatment needs and issues for specific racial and ethnic minorities. Native Americans have the highest risk for substance abuse of any racial minority group. Primarily, the substance abuse concerns for American Indians and Alaska Natives lie in heavy alcohol use and binge drinking, which are higher than all other racial groups in the country. Additionally, the fact that some individuals live away from specialized health service facilities for the cultural group contributes to increasing disparity. Lastly, American Indians and Alaskan Natives experience higher average rates of trauma within their cultural group compared to that of the general population. This creates an increase in substance abuse and need for treatment. A few counselor considerations for working with American Indians or Alaskan Natives are incorporating traditional services such as talking circles, smudging, drumming, beating, or dancing, awareness of their chronic and historical trauma, their cultural perspective on collectivism rather than individualism, their views of human relatedness with nature, and the integration of spirituality and other traditional ceremony or healing customs. It is suggested that behavior change for American Indians or Alaskan Natives participating in substance abuse treatment programs is more likely from a collaborative, ceremonial, or spiritual approach to substance abuse treatment rather than the confrontational approach used in traditional substance abuse treatment programming.
So the next group we have is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. This culture makes up approximately 19 million of the U.S. population as of the 2017 census. This culture has a variety of unique subcultures within the group. This can include Chinese Americans, Native Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, etc. The estimated drug use overall for this culture group is 3.7%, with some subgroups as high as 6.9%. Until recently, we had very little data about drug abuse, specifically in Asian American communities, and that's because a lot of national studies would omit them altogether or just lump them altogether in a generalized category of other. This led to this community being understudied and assumed not to have drug abuse problems, which further perpetuates the model minority stereotype, which is very harmful and definitely contributes to this community not getting access to the help that they need. Some considerations that should be kept in mind when working from people from different Asian American cultures are language barriers. A lot of Asian cultures have emphasis on emotional restraint, family hierarchy, and the importance of not bringing shame onto oneself or one's family. This puts a lot of stigma on them seeking professional help because it can be seen as very shameful. One way to give them avenues that can help circumvent this is by providing options that include anonymity. Some issues that you should definitely be aware of when working with this culture is that acculturation is a big problem. Treatment can often be seen as a form of acculturation. You need to be very careful to make sure that whatever treatment you're using isn't acculturating, because In a treatment setting, this can be considered coercive and therefore unethical. Something else to keep in mind is acculturation stress is often what can lead to substance abuse in these communities because it is a form of coping. So just know that when you're working with people in this community with substance abuse.
Latinos or Latinx includes heritages from diverse cultures such as Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, or South and Central American countries. They are the largest minority population within the United States, and the findings of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, known as NIDA, show higher rates of drug abuse among young Latinos in comparison to their non-Latino counterparts. Factors such as economic status, education, drug availability, and racism can attribute to the stresses Latinos experience. So being vulnerable to these factors can result in alcohol and drug abuse. A study in 2003 pointed to 7 client-level factors associated with higher likelihood of successfully completing outpatient treatment. The factors were 1, alcohol use as a primary substance, 2, employment, 3, less than daily substance use at admission, 4, gender was taken into consideration, so females were more successful. 5, people older than 40 were more successful, so age was a factor as well. 6, more than 12 years of education was another significant factor. And lastly, culture was taken into consideration. So non-Latino white individuals were more likely to complete a treatment program. And this research all came from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Next, some considerations when working with substance abuse clients in the Latino culture. It is important to become informed and involved with the Latino family. So collaborating with members, understanding the power of family, the amount of influence family has, learning the values, and becoming aware of the adversities is salient when working with a Latino client and their family. Young Latinos will start treatment without having any type of previous history. So due to their needs not being met, dropout rates are high during the initial stages of treatment. Drug choices varies from subgroup to subgroup. So opiates are common with the Puerto Rican subgroup. Cubans report using cocaine, and Mexicans and Central and South Americans report primarily using alcohol. So national data revealed that more than 1/4 of Puerto Ricans in need of treatment during the previous year received it, compared with 13% of Mexicans, and then 6.6% of Central and South Americans, and 9% of other Latinos. This all, again, comes from the SAMHSA website and resources.
African Americans constitute approximately 13.3% of the U.S. population and claim ancestry from Africa and the Caribbean, as well as many parts of Central and South America. These persons share common racial and cultural characteristics. The arrival of Africans into America stands apart from all other cultural, ethnic, and racial groups who began new lives in this country. While every other group arrived voluntarily, Africans were uprooted and brought to America involuntarily as slaves. This has had profound sociocultural, economic, and psychological effects on the experience of African Americans, resulting in traumatic cultural losses and significant disparities in access to education, employment, healthcare, and financial services. This racism continues to subtly shape policies and practices while limiting access to the ladder of success. Today, substance use in the African American communities continues to contribute to disproportionate rates of violence and health difficulties. An additional contextual factor is the extent to which African American urban communities are targeted for liquor and tobacco advertising. This targeted advertising inherently encourages use and addiction for this population. Illicit drug use disorder among African Americans is 3.4%. Alcohol use disorder is 5.6%. Substance abuse treatment admissions for African Americans was 18% in 2014. These are some common attributes among African Americans. They have great awareness of the historical background that still shapes policy today. Negative experiences with society, particularly white dominant culture, have made African Americans resistant to treatment that is typically provided by the dominant culture. They may have different beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors toward health. They may have more external stressors that impede treatment, such as socioeconomic status and family influences. They have lower rates of use, but higher rates of problems associated with alcohol, such as HIV and AIDS, incarceration, and higher mortality rates. Disproportionate rates of poverty, family dissolution, unemployment, incarceration, as mentioned before, ill health, and shortened lifespan. Women are more affected by negative images of themselves compared to other groups and tend to internalize these images. The African American community is very community-based. Therefore, they look to community or religious leaders when seeking help. Counselor considerations for working with the African American population. Chang and Robinson found that compared with white Americans, African Americans with mental disorders or substance abuse problems are less likely to receive treatment. Counselors should understand that some African Americans view mental health providers with mistrust, stemming from experiences they have had with culturally incompetent therapists. The bias, at times outright discrimination, against minority clients that some practitioners and agencies exhibit indeed affects African Americans' use of professional services, as well as the content and quality of services used. Sue et al. Believe the most important characteristic for African Americans is the cultural sensitivity of the counselor. Culturally sensitive counselors, those who acknowledge the possibility that race or culture might play a role in a client's problem, are seen as more competent than culture or colorblind counselors. Counselors working with this population should integrate the impact of race, gender, and sexual orientation, which may include womanist, feminist theory, and how these factors can create material consequences in the lives of African American women. They should provide skills training, integrate religion and spirituality, encourage fellowship of family, friends, and religious leaders, have treatment programs with counselors and staff of color, provide an ethic of caring, the sharing of one's own experience. In particular, counselors who have had their own success in recovery may be received well by African American clients.
Multiracial Americans are the fastest growing demographic in the United States. This has grown 32% from 2000 to 2010. Lacking research makes it difficult to determine reasons behind substance use. Multiracial ethnic identity may decrease as in age, meaning their identity development is not as linear as other races. Interpersonal and institutional discrimination, parental divorce, and identity crisis all increase risks of substance abuse. Multiracial Ethnic Counseling Concerns, or MRECC, constructed the competencies for counseling the multiracial populations. This organization prioritizes doing anything they can to assist with multiracial families, couples, and individuals. The primary competencies focus on working with transracial adoptees and the Transracial Adoption Kinship Network. Mental health professionals' self-awareness is key to being effective when working with multiracial clients through intake, assessment, intervention, and treatment. Counselors should possess cultural humility, the skill to recognize what values are held close by the client while keeping one's own perspective clear. This allows mental health professionals to be more aware of their limitations as a counselor while keeping an open mind.
So when talking about different cultures, races, ethnicities, and identities, one thing to keep in mind is racial and cultural identity models. Race is viewed as a psychological variable rather than demographic. This allows for individual identification within racial groups, which allows a lot more room for identifying uniquely to how you would like to identify and defining your own racial identity. The most commonly used racial identity models would be Helms' racial identity model. His model for racial minority involves the development of racial identity in a process that involves working through attitudes and behaviors of internalized racism. His model for white people involves acknowledging racism at an individual, institutional, and cultural level, and then taking steps to dedicate towards moving away from identification with these ideals. Multicultural and social justice competencies. In working with racial minorities, it's imperative to understand that all people are culture-bound and effective counseling must reflect the client's culture. The 4 domains of this include counselor self-awareness, client worldview, counseling relationship, and counseling and advocacy interventions. Counselor self-awareness means to acknowledge your assumptions, worldviews, values, and beliefs as members of privileged and marginalized groups, how it affects you and impacts others, and practice cultural humility. Client worldview includes counselors being aware of their own emotional reactions, continuing education and seeking knowledge about cultures beyond counseling sessions, and understanding barriers and hindrances to treatment. Counseling, relationship, and counseling and advocacy interventions include culturally competent counselors educating their clients as well as their communities in an effort to eliminate bias, prejudice, and discrimination.